Shades of Freedom, a pre and post Juneteenth conversation led by my esteemed colleague, Dr. Heather Burton, and myself. And we'll be getting started shortly as Dr. Burton shares her screen.
Good afternoon, everyone. Myself and VP Solomon, we thank you for being with us this afternoon. And kind of to begin, and we want you to understand that as we go throughout this presentation, we have some historical information to talk about as we deal in Shades of Freedom, as well as an opportunity for discussion later in the conversation. However, though, if you see something in the presentation as we're talking, please do not hesitate to unmute, raise your hand through the chat method to signify that you would like to say something. We welcome comments and conversation as we go throughout the presentation. To start us off, James Baldwin begins with the quote, "Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can change unless it is faced." And so it's time for us to face history and to face the truth of history and what it means, what Juneteenth specifically has meant to us as a nation, as a community, as individuals. And so we decided that in order to really deal with Juneteenth and the effects of Juneteenth and the delayed response is to take you kind of through a historical perspective of where we are as a nation, as America, from the perspective of policy and legal acts to get us where we are today. So we began with 1619 and slavery in America. It's really important to understand that on August 20th, 1619, over 400 years ago, there was a ship that was the White Lion. And historically, we hear very often about I'm going to go real quickly to this slide just because with the time. So we think about 1619 and we never focus on the White Lion in this aspect of the year 1619, but historically in our history classes and textbooks, we've learned about the Mayflower. We've learned about 1620 and the Mayflower, but in 1619, there was the White Lion, and the White Lion made its landfall at Point Comfort, Virginia. What's important about this is that here is the credit of 20 Negroes coming to, or I should say 20 Negroes being brought to the Americas that began this landmark negative aspect of discriminatory practices and things that happened within America in 1619. But it's also important to point out that Negroes didn't make, 1619 wasn't the first time that Black people were in the Americas, is that they existed before. And then we also have to credit the fact that Native Americans were here before 1619. And so really thinking about a historical connotation. Just recently, I had the opportunity to be in New Orleans and look at some of the historical issues and cases in New Orleans as it relates to slavery and the Atlantic slave trade and what transpired. And so race, slavery, and the ideology. Many people you hear often, they talk about slavery and this aspect of slavery. And they say, well, there was slavery beforehand and slavery existed. There was slavery in the Bible. There was slavery in biblical days. Yes, slavery did exist. But when we talk about slavery built on a dehumanization factor of stripping a culture of who they were, their identity, and everything that they were a part of, this is where we get slavery in America. This is where we get chattel slavery. And so I used to tell my students when I taught the Intro to Pan-African Studies class, if you want to think about slaves in America, think about that chair that you're sitting in right now. And if you put your hands on that chair, you can hit that chair, you can beat that chair, you can pick that chair up, you can throw it. That chair is responsible. You are responsible for that chair in terms of that chair going everywhere with you. That is what slavery in America meant. It meant property, that Black, Negroes, coloreds were nothing more than property and ownership to an individual. And so that dehumanization created a lot of entities or negative aspects that come from the treatment of slaves and during a time of enslavement. And so slavery, as I mentioned and talked about, when slavery being race blinded, originally that wasn't the system that slavery was built upon. But as we move forward and we think about slavery in America, switched from an indentured service. And you could probably think about indentured servitude was usually a typical serving period of 7 years. And then after 7 years, freedom was offered to that indentured servant. And so what slavery did was it stripped of culture. And that culture could be from the perspective of economics, language barriers. And so it caused different policies to come about from that. And one of the, or some of the policies that came about was slave codes and the enactment of slave codes. And there are over hundreds of slave codes that were enacted to justify slavery in America, where Blacks could not bear arms, Blacks could not join together with more than one, Blacks could not learn to read, they could not teach others to learn to read and write if you had that opportunity to be able to read and write. And so the list goes on in terms of what slave codes exist. Slave codes also prevented or caused for the reenactment of free Blacks when we get into the point of this idea of quasi-free Blacks. And quasi-free meant that you were never free as a Black person in America, because you could always be enslaved at any opportunity. Your papers could be taken, they could be torn up, they could be burned, and you could be enslaved again. And that really happened after the mass production of cotton. I always joke with Eli Whitney and the invention of the cotton gin. In that mass production of cotton, slave owners had to find an alternative to get more slaves. So what did they do? They created opportunities for inbreeding and then also re-enslaving individuals who were free. And I talked about the Mayflower, and I really, from a historical perspective, want you all to think about how history has been, the narrative of history has only been told from one viewpoint, from a Eurocentric viewpoint. And we have to add in the truth of history and the overarching truth of history as it relates to an Afrocentric viewpoint and a Eurocentric viewpoint to add in all aspects of history. And so
we move to this next slide, and actually it's tied together for this reason. And what Dr. Burton and I are doing is actually taking us through a historical view of many of the highs and lows that are bookends to Juneteenth, as we think about Juneteenth as that demarcation of freedom, right? Or free-ish, as we learn to hear in common culture. But as she indicated, that chattel slavery initially was not race-based, but the slave codes were designed to move to that direction. And what we recognize is that slavery became the economic engine that undergirded the development of the US. And so this slide is actually just a reminder of just how enslaved Africans were viewed as mere property. And this was what slavery was all about, that there is the sense that individuals are simply property, and that's how it is treated. So this reward is offered. At that time, $500 is the reward, which sort of tells how valuable chattel slavery was during that time. And I'll also add the other thing with the slave codes that Heather mentioned, and that is that there's some individuals who were never enslaved. There were some Blacks who were never enslaved, but were captured and pulled into slavery, and they had no way or very little means to prove that they had never been enslaved. And so that was the nature of it. Let's go to our next slide. And our next slide here, and what we'll do is we will weave in our third branch of government, the judiciary, and look at how the judiciary played its role in either advancing or limiting the rights of Black people throughout the course of history. Remember, we're tracing 1619 through 2021. And so the Dred Scott case, many of you may have heard about it, in 1857. Now, this is before Juneteenth, before the Emancipation Proclamation. But this particular case is a landmark decision, and the Supreme Court held, as you can see it there, that the US Constitution was not meant to include American citizenship for Black people. And here's a greater key: regardless of whether they were enslaved or free. And so the rights and privileges of the Constitution confers upon American citizens could not apply to them. So there is this notion that African descended people, certainly from the perspective of the Supreme Court at that time, and certainly from the perspective of the drafters of our Constitution, were never intended to be free, were never intended to have the rights of citizenship, were intended to simply continue the economic engine that we saw that existed in the US. And we can go to our next slide. So, you know, the famous Fannie Lou Hamer quote, "Nobody's free until everybody's free." And I think this is important because it is a realization that freedom, as we understand it, limits everyone if everyone does not have freedom. And there's lots of work that really explores why this is problematic, even though individuals in our society ignore it. In Heather McGhee's book, which recently came out, and Heather McGhee was our convocation speaker, she poses the question, you know, why can't we all have nice things? In her book, The Sum of Us really explores the economic detriment to everyone in society when we deny freedom, when we deny rights, when we engage in oppression and discrimination and racism, that everyone is limited and none of us can really reach our true potential. So let's go back in history to freedom policies.
Yes, and so with this, we have freedom policies and the question mark, because what I ask you all today is to think about what is freedom and how do you define freedom? And we have all of these policies that are in place that pretty much are supposed to guarantee freedom, or we're supposed to guarantee this idea of freedom. And so when we look, we have the start of the Civil War. So now remember, we went from 1619 slavery. And so you go from 1619, the credited date, to 1861 and the Civil War, the start of Civil War in Fort Sumter, South Carolina. If you never had an opportunity, visit Fort Sumter. I had the opportunity to see Fort Sumter in South Carolina, but to see where the Civil War began. And so here's the start of the Civil War. And the Civil War, really, slavery was a catalyst to the Civil War, but it was really about maintaining the Union. And how do we keep the Union together? And so in that, when we talk about freedom policies, and we think about the fact that slavery was the catalyst, but the ultimate goal was keeping the Union together, what does that say about really the freedom of Blacks in America? So I was going to mute, but they muted. And so when we think about the Emancipation Proclamation, and I was just reading, I had an opportunity to sit, and I hope many of you on this call had the opportunity to be a part of the College of Arts and Sciences presentation yesterday on Juneteenth, which was an excellent conversation around Dr. Annette Gordon Reed's book. But talking about on Juneteenth, but then in that, I had the opportunity to watch a video that VP Solomon had sent me. And VP Solomon, you can help me out. I can't remember the name of the person, but it was talking about, here's the Emancipation Proclamation, right? And so 1863, what are we taught in our history textbooks? And I really want you all to take into consideration what you were taught in elementary school, middle school, high school, and some of you even in college that may have majored in history and lost the aspect of the overarching historical connotation of everything. When we think about Emancipation Proclamation, many of us were taught that the Emancipation Proclamation freed the slaves. That's what we were taught in the textbook, is that 1863 freed the slaves. Well, the Emancipation Proclamation changed the direction of the Civil War, but it didn't offer the freedom. Again, going back to freedom policies, question? Let's think about these freedom policies. And so despite the expansive wording that all persons held as slaves within any state or designated part of a state, the people whereof shall then be in rebellion against the United States, shall be then thenceforward and forever free. So despite all of this wording, this expansive wording, it was limited in many ways because this only applied to states that had seceded from the United States, leaving slavery untouched in those states that were loyal borders to the Union. It also expressly exempted parts of the Confederacy that had already come under Northern control. But most importantly, the freedom it promised depended upon the Union's military victory. And so here we have the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, which has historically been taught in one direction as to what it really did, not understanding that the Emancipation Proclamation did not offer the freedom that it has been taught to us that it did. And then we fast forward to 1865, 2 years later. Now, this is 2 years later after the Emancipation Proclamation, and we get the 13th Amendment that is passed on January 31st, but then ratified on December 6th of 1865, which ultimately in that ratification freed or abolished slavery, I should say, because if we look at slavery, if we talk about Blacks, they were enslaved, and really getting away from this idea of slavery as an individual, but being slavery also as a mindset. And so there was this institution of slavery. So really thinking about that. And the 13th Amendment stated neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime, whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. Now we can get onto a whole nother conversation. We talk about the 13th Amendment and this clause in the 13th Amendment, except as a punishment for crime. But I'm not going to go there today. I'll say that for another presentation. Me and VP Solomon might do it another day. But when we talk about, the 13th Amendment, and I want you to think about dates, because with the next slide that I'm going to, I want you to really concentrate on dates. So 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation. But then we had to come back with the 13th Amendment in 1865, January 31st. Now, in between January 31st and December 6th of 1865, there was an event that happened. And that event is why we're here today, is Juneteenth. And so on June 19th, 1865, after the Civil War ends, which was April 9th, 1865, we get Juneteenth. And Juneteenth is shortened for June 19th. And it marks the day when federal troops arrived in Galveston, Texas in 1865 to take control of the state and to ensure that all enslaved people are now free. The troops' arrival came a full 2.5 years after the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation. But Juneteenth, now we know, honors the end to slavery in the United States and considered the longest running African-American holiday. And it's important to understand that, and that's why I was bringing this in earlier, but on Juneteenth, Dr. Gordon Reed talks about how she really at one point felt very territorial about Juneteenth, is that Juneteenth should have been a day only celebrated by Texans and not by the rest of the world. But then she had to pull back and gain an understanding that Juneteenth was a celebration for all, because it allowed an aspect of freedom to be told that had not been told. And if you think in your mind, we go from 1863 with the Emancipation Proclamation, and then we go to January 31st, 1865 with the 13th Amendment, April 9th, the ending of the Civil War, and then June 19th, where freedom being announced in Texas, to December 6th, 1865 to abolish slavery. And I look at this and I say, why do we always need a policy on top of a policy on top of a policy to gain freedom if freedom was supposed to be accomplished with the Emancipation Proclamation? And so we still have to think about how policy on top of policy has changed. And has policy on top of policy continues to happen in order to create these changes. And so with Juneteenth, you had 250,000 enslaved people who were told that they were now free in the state of Texas. And so we continue with I lost my notes, I'm sorry. And that the year following 1865, freedmen in Texas organized the first of what became the annual celebration of Jubilee Day on June 19th. And decades, Juneteenth followed, commemorating with featured music, barbecues, prayer services, and other activities. As Black people migrated from Texas to other parts of the country, the Juneteenth tradition spread. In 1979, Texas became the first state to make Juneteenth an official holiday. 47 states recognize Juneteenth as a state holiday, while efforts to make it a national holiday have so far, I didn't check my news today. Did it pass Congress yesterday, Robert?
Yes, Congress, so it came out of the Senate, it has passed Congress, so now it is waiting for the signature of President Biden, which we know he will
sign. So that's a great accomplishment today as we continue to talk about Juneteenth and moving forward. Additional policies that we want to talk about are the 14th and 15th Amendment. And the 14th Amendment provides citizenship. And Robert had previously talked about Dred Scott versus Sanford. And so the 14th Amendment overruled Dred Scott versus Sanford and provided citizenship. And then the 15th Amendment provided the right to vote. And when we think about those different aspects of these, we're going to get into it a little later, but again, thinking about policy on top of policy that's supposed to offer us freedom. Because if 1869, we have the 14th Amendment, 1870, the 15th Amendment. Why do we need the Civil Rights Act of 64, and why do we need the Voting Rights Act of 68 if we had the 15th Amendment to give us the right to vote? And so really thinking about this aspect of policy and what it does and how policy does not change mindset. Freedom is a road seldom traveled by the multitude. And freedom is also a mindset change. Besides a policy change, it's also a mindset change. How do we begin to stop thinking in an enslavement capacity or enslavement mindset and thinking that we are less than and making other people believe that we are less than or not less than? And so freedom is a road seldom traveled by the multitude.
And I think this is really important, as Heather's pointed out, because when we think about the mindset, and as we talk about Reconstruction, and we'll get into this a little bit more towards the end of our discussion of these concepts and ideas, but it is really important that proper education is critical, because that can impact whether those policies stay in place, whether they are firm. And I think it's important for us to look at Reconstruction from 1865 to 1877, because what you will see is that during that time, after the official end of slavery, if you will, when the 13th Amendment was ratified in December of 1865, we see that there was amazing progress. And that land was given to those who were formerly enslaved. Black people began to participate in the political process. They had even gained prominence such that they were elected to Congress, right? So you have all this progress that happened, and in many ways, we could say it's even like now. You remember, we've had an African-American president, and there was all this hope and growth and what went on. But what we also must recognize that every time that there is progress, there is also pushback and backlash. And we're seeing it happen today. But I view Reconstruction and post-Reconstruction as an example of what happens in our society. And so what happened under President Andrew Johnson, he allowed for the implementation of all these Black codes. And these laws were enacted to control the labor and the behavior of former enslaved people and other African Americans. And so these Black codes came into being, which allowed for further subjugation of Black people. Along with the Black codes, there was a rise of the Ku Klux Klan, which was part of the carnage that existed, that brutalized Black people. And by the end of all of this backlash, by the end of all of these Black codes and all these things that happened, that it, for instance, it limited Blacks to mostly agricultural forms of employment, restricted areas of residence, which was the precursor to our redlining, permitted only segregated and unequal education opportunities. All of these things, the Black codes, are representative of systems that were put in place to subjugate Black people and to create this retrenchment from the progress that came out of Reconstruction. And I am not, I'm an optimistic person. I'm not a doomsday kind of person, but I believe we need to look at this in history to remind us that all of the progress that we currently enjoy is not guaranteed. Because we have seen these cycles turn over and over again in history. I think that there are things we can do, but I believe it means that we must stay engaged politically. We must stay engaged in our communities. We must stay engaged as advocates to make sure that we don't return, those cycles do not return. Let's go to the next slide.
I wanted to build really quickly, VP Solomon.
Yes.
On listening to, as you talk, a couple different things. One, you brought out President Obama and the election. And we experienced this whole idea that we were living in a post-racial society after he was elected. Post-colorist society, is that racism and all aspects of discrimination as it related to race did not exist anymore because we had elected a Black president. And we quickly saw, as the cycle that you talked about, progress, and then what happens after progress. We get back into the same society, the same cycle of how do we subjugate Black people? How do we put them back into a place? And going to the aspect of lynching, James Cone talks about in his book, The Cross and the Lynching Tree, and I know you've read that book, and does this comparison between the cross and the lynching tree. And he makes reference to how even lynching was not initially put in place against Black people, but after or during Reconstruction and after Reconstruction, because of the progress of Blacks and the position that Blacks were holding. Interestingly, historically, the number of Blacks that were in political positions in Reconstruction, this year is the first time in history that that number has been as large as it was since Reconstruction. And so when we think about a historical perspective of the subjugation of Blacks' progress and then being put back in subjugation, and thinking about lynching, and that the KKK was put in place to subjugate, because it originally started as a social order and a social club. But how do we maintain our social order and our white supremacy as to what our belief system, and I shouldn't say we, but what their belief systems were as it related to the KKK, is that you begin to subjugate Blacks through the aspect of lynching. So I just wanted to add that aspect as well.
No, absolutely, absolutely. It's great insight. I use this quote from the National Geographic, the photographer Lene O'Neill, and he makes this quote: "It costs you dearly to see them, but it costs you more to look away." And as we go through, we will show you photographs throughout history, because those photographs, even though it pains us to see some of them, it is important for us to see it to understand and recognize that it costs us more to look away. It costs us more to ignore history. It costs us more to pretend that certain things in society didn't happen. Let's go to the next slide, because this is kind of a building upon the Black codes. So, we've heard about Jim Crow, right? 1877, all the way through 1954. Some of us are familiar with Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow, which looks at our criminal justice system and how it is another way to really reinstitute slavery in our criminal justice system. But Jim Crow in its original form were laws that enforced racial segregation in the South, and it began in oppressive actions that really gave birth to the civil rights movement as we know it. Recognizing that these laws were in place to really, it was the bridge from the Black codes, right? Remember, we had slave codes, then we had Black codes, now we have Jim Crow laws that are in place with all the same design to subjugate Black people. And so, and mind you, we're after, if this goes through 1954, we're after Juneteenth, where freedom was declared, which is why you hear, tongue in cheek and some sense of humor that Black people are free-ish, right? Because with all these things that are going on, with all these things that are taking place with policy, practices, and laws, the freedom has still been limited along the course of things. Let's go to the next slide, because this is one that really reminds us, it's hard to look at this, but people took their children to lynchings, that this was a time of celebration and it was a jovial experience to watch the murder of Black people. Now, this is the course of our history, and it is rising again. Next slide. When I look at this almost looks like the insurrection to me, and it's even milder than the insurrection, and we'll get to that along this continuum. But here we have that same sentiment that there is this desire to limit the rights of Black people. And we know that it will expand beyond just Black people, but this will also be applied to Latinx people and Asian people and other people of color, because all of these things are built on notions of white supremacy. So this is white nationalism and racism run amok. Next slide. This is to remind us of the limitations on voting. Efforts to prevent Black people from engaging in the political process and voting. Does that sound familiar to us? Mind you, this is during Jim Crow, but we are now in 2021, and how many states have enacted laws to limit voting, knowing that those limitations will have significant impact on Black and brown communities and on some poor white communities, right? Remember Heather McGee's book, that some of those efforts hurt everybody, right? These efforts hurt everybody, not just the targets. The next slide. This is to remind us of segregation, right? That there's this effort to maintain segregation. So this takes us to Plessy versus Ferguson, which is our next case, our milestone. Again, our Supreme Court in 1896, in the case of Plessy versus Ferguson, many of you have heard it, the Supreme Court decision upholding the constitutionality of racial segregation, even in public accommodations. In this case, it was a railroad under the doctrine of separate but equal. Well, everyone knew that separate was not equal. It wasn't even near equal. So in spite of this, next slide, in spite of this segregation, we have an example of grit, determination, and the success of Black people coming together, the descendants of slaves, and creating an economic engine that certainly thrived in Tulsa, Oklahoma, back in the early 1900s. And this prosperity, this progress was so offensive to other individuals in our community that they massacred the individuals.
Okay, so
we know this as Black Wall Street, right? That in 1921, and we just had the 100-year mark of the massacre of the residents of Greenwood, Oklahoma. And it certainly is one of the most significant events. It was following World War I, you know, that it recognized this area as one of the most affluent communities in all of America, where they had hotels and schools and businesses, and it was thriving. But because of that progress, they were attacked, murdered, and everything was bombed and destroyed. I think it's important to recognize that in the arc of history, we see again where there is progress, there is retrenchment, and frustration, where people of color, where Black people in this particular case, have come under attack. Our next slide. So that's a low point. Let's look to the next point. The Supreme Court decision of Shelley versus Kramer. And we add this because this case really shows where there's an effort to move in another direction. So the Supreme Court held this unanimously, that if a state were to enforce a racially restrictive covenant, it would discriminate on the basis of race and thus violate Shelley's right to equal protection of laws. And so this applied the 14th Amendment, and the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment applied to people of color, and that this was prohibited. So this is a positive milestone that we see happening. But again, the question is, how will this be implemented? All right. And the next one is Brown versus Board of Education. We're all familiar with the Brown case, because now Brown is significant because it says that separate is not equal, setting the precedent and dismantling other racial segregation laws and irrevocably altering the course of racial relations in America. So Brown is particularly significant because it moves us forward in recognizing that we will no longer be under separate but equal. The problem is, and we'll see this further, and Heather will move us into the civil rights movement, but what we see is that even though these laws were in place, there was still backlash, refusal, and efforts to not implement many of the things that happened. You know, this decision said that this should be done in all deliberate speed. This was in 1954. Many of you are aware of still desegregation cases happening in the 70s, trying to implement desegregation orders, et cetera. So let's look at the civil rights movement.
And so we began to think about the civil rights movements from 1950s and 1960s. Malcolm X says you can separate peace from freedom because no one can be at peace unless he has his freedom. Malcolm X also has another quote that I paraphrase by very often, where he says that if you try to teach, the Black man has been taught misinformation for so long. And so when you try to teach the Black man the truth, he won't believe it. So you have to teach it incrementally. And when we think about history, is that history has to be taught incrementally because so often the truth has been neglected and negated throughout. And when we think the civil rights movement, there were a couple catalysts that happened with the civil rights movement that created this the desire to we've got to have change. And so we think of some of our historians that existed for the civil rights movement, such as Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, you know, others that fought in the 20s, Ida B. Wells. And when we think, there was one in particular, there was Emmett Till, in the case of Emmett Till. And Emmett Till, Mamie Till says, and if you ever do a comparison or a study, take a look at Trayvon Martin and Sabrina Fulton and see the comparatives and the parallels that exist between that case and the case of Emmett Till. But Mamie Till said, you know what? I want everyone to see the brutality that was done to my son. So she allowed for Emmett Till's face to grace the media images, photographs. And so the world had to see this 15-year-old boy and the brutality that existed with this 15-year-old boy from an accusation of him whistling at a white woman. And we know that Carolyn Bryant came back in her latter years of life and admitted that she lied. And so you see that mistruth, but Emmett Till was a catalyst, one of the many catalysts to the civil rights movement, specifically, you know, when we're talking about after Brown versus Board of Education. And so Robert talks about the progress and then the regress that happens after. And so we think about, here's Brown versus Board of Education. But when we also think about Brown versus Board of Education, and we think about this aspect of education, notice how with the educational system, and we talk about integration happened where Black students were moved into white school areas, and not where white students were moved into Black areas, or the majority of Black teachers were kept in Black neighborhoods and not integrated within white systems except for a few. And if we ever think about this idea of integration is one of those things that was supposed to provide full equality. And so when we're talking about freedom policies or freedom philosophical thoughts, integration never has provided full equality as it relates to Black. When we also think about this idea of integration, what happens in integration when, or I should say, what happens in integration is that only time whites are moved into Black areas is when they are created to be conducive to the needs of white individuals. And so we get into aspects of gentrification and other philosophical thoughts that happen around this idea of integration. And so really looking or thinking about integration as, who does integration really benefit? And so you saw with Plessy versus Ferguson, separate but equal. That was the premise of Jim Crow. But then Board versus Education was said, we're supposed to wipe that out. But when we still have the economic disparities, the health disparities, the educational disparities that exist within the Black community based on this concept of separate but equal that never happened, but we put integration in place to try to combat that, but integration still did not assist in helping that. And so with civil rights, we move into 1964 and the Civil Rights Act. And the Civil Rights Act provided or banned discrimination based on race, color, religion, or national origin in employment practices and public accommodations. But if we had citizenship with the 14th Amendment, why do we need the Civil Rights Act? If we were provided full citizenship, that should have gave us all equality, all space, all access to everything that white America had. But it didn't. So we had to come now, because what happened after the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment, we went from slave codes, as Robert said, we went from slave codes to Black codes to Jim Crow. And then if we move beyond 1964, Michelle Alexander talks about the new Jim Crow, mass incarceration. And we talk about other aspects that continue to keep Black people in a system of not being able to have progress. And so we've got the Civil Rights Act of 64. Then we have the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Again, I say, but wait, Heather, wait, didn't we have the 15th Amendment that said everyone had the right to vote? Yes, Heather, we did. So why do we need the Voting Rights Act of 65? Yet again, here we go. How do we combat policies that cause advancement for Black people? We create things like voter suppression, acts of voter suppression. And so we put different policies in place. We start asking for driver's license. We start saying that if you're not in this neighborhood, you can't vote. And so we get into this same space that we have from the 15th Amendment when there was a right to vote. and we put Jim Crow in place. It says, if you can't pass this literacy test, if you can't read, if you can't write, if you can't sign your name, then you can't vote. So here we have the Voting Rights Act of 65, and we know what has transpired with the Voting Rights Act of 65. It's been amended in the 1970, 1975, and it's been amended in 2008. And then we move into, I'm going to pass this back over to, I was about to get real carried away with Loving versus Virginia, because this is another one. And I joke, and I'm going to pass it to Robert, but with Loving versus Virginia, I actually saw this movie in Virginia. I happened to be in Virginia when the movie Loving versus Virginia came out, and I saw this movie. And interestingly, I am very daring when it comes to certain things. I was also in Virginia at that time and decided to go to a Confederate museum by myself, which was quite an experience. I'll share it with you all one day. VP Solomon?
Yeah, so it is important to talk about the Loving case, and we'll jump back to more civil rights legislation. But I just wanted to add to something that Heather posed. Why do we need the Voting Rights Act of 1965? Because of the reactions of the pushback on the efforts of Black and brown people to engage in voting. So, and she talked about poll taxes and literacy tests and all these different things. And we see modern versions of it. Really, it's current day voter suppression. But Loving versus Virginia is another marker, if you will, where the Supreme Court declared the Virginia anti-miscegenation law, which prohibited basically marrying outside of your race. It was an invidious racial discrimination and violated due process, the Due Process Clause and Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. This is actually a precursor to what we saw in marriage equality that came down not too long ago. So we can see how decisions can move things forward. But that was just a brief detour. Now let's get back to the Civil Rights Act of 1968, or 67 and 68.
Yeah. 60. But I think it's important, and even though with Loving versus Virginia, it's that brief detour, but as you said, it's really important for people to understand even the interracial relationships that we take for granted today of being allowed, and how mixed racing and the idea of a Black person being with specifically a Black male with a white woman can end in lynching, or end with a white woman being ostracized from her community, or even being killed for any type of communication, conversation with a Black male, and even the reverse when we talk about Black women. But because Black women were such the property and subjugation of white males, then very often a Black woman couldn't yell rape. A Black woman couldn't yell abuse or anything when it came to a white male, and the white male suffer the same repercussions that a Black male did in engaging with a white female. But the Civil Rights Act of 68 is the Fair Housing Act. And so yet again, here we go with the Fair Housing Act of 68. And so this idea that the Civil Rights Act of 68 prohibited the discrimination concerning the sale, rental, and financing of housing based on race, religion, national origin. And as of 74, it applied to gender, 1988 to protect persons with disabilities and families with children. The Civil Rights Act of 68, when you think about the housing market and what Blacks had to endure, they endured such things as redlining that prevented the opportunity to buy. And my mind just went blank. Robert, help me out with the other word that's used, where if a Black person wanted to buy a house, they had to trust that a white person would pay the mortgage. So they paid this white person the mortgage, the money, and they had to trust that they were actually paying their mortgages and insuring. And my mind went blank as to what it's called. But thinking about the housing market as it relates to the discriminatory practice. Or, and many of you have seen A Raisin in the Sun. And even though we talk about that being a play, but it gives a great example of homeowners associations. And we have so many Black people on the call today that, you know, we get excited with our new homeowners associations, but when we think historically, the purpose of homeowners associations was to exclude us and to exclude us from those neighborhoods and being a part.
No, I can't think of the name of it either, Heather. It'll come to me. But it's interesting because those restrictive covenants and leases and homeowners associations really prevailed. And I told this story before. When we were getting ready, my old church in Columbus, Ohio, had bought a building from another church. And when we got ready to sell the church, we discovered that an old restrictive covenant was in there, even though it had been outlawed at the time, which said that it could not be sold to Black people, that those things were actually in the deed and the restrictive covenants, but those things were outlawed. I want to take you real briefly because we want to get to a point so we can still have some discussion time. I want to take you briefly through some cases to again show progress and change. So this is called the Regents of the University of California versus Bakke, a 1978 case. So during the advent of affirmative action in higher education, there was a lot of effort to basically undo the effects of discrimination. You know, we covered it all through this history. And we didn't even cover all of the efforts that had been done where Black people could not attend many colleges and universities across the nation. And so that had a significant impact on the Black community. In fact, one of my heroes is Fred Gray. Fred Gray went to law school here at Case Western University because the state of Alabama paid for Fred Gray to go to Case because they did not want him to go to a law school in the state of Alabama. That's how much they were determined to maintain segregation. So anyway, we were making progress in dismantling all those things. And now, again, it's a twist. So all of a sudden, now the Supreme Court is saying, well, these affirmative action programs, now you're hearing people talk about reverse discrimination. So the Bakke case was someone who sued because they didn't get into medical school. But what the Supreme Court held in this case was that although it really limited the ability of universities to utilize race in the solution based upon past discrimination, it did say that diversity in higher education was a compelling government interest. So it did allow diversity to be used as a basis for admission in higher education. And you'll see this play out some more. But what happened was, some of you may not remember that we went from affirmative action to diversity. And this case is an example of that transition. Okay, let's go to the next slide. So the next case that we're looking at is Batson versus Kentucky. Again, a case that should be positive, a 1986 case that provided a legal avenue for defendants in a criminal trial to protest the discriminatory use of peremptory challenges on the basis of race, as this was proven to violate the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. Basically, if you are on trial, the lawyers get so many challenges to jurors, and you don't have to give a reason, right? You could just say, you know, if there's a cause, you can challenge as many as you want. But they have something that's called peremptory challenges. So you may just be getting the wrong feeling about somebody and say, no, I don't want this person to sit on this jury. Well, what was happening is that there were prosecutors who were getting rid of all Black people on juries or all Latinx people on juries. And so it really was a discriminatory process. So basically, in Batson versus Kentucky, the Supreme Court says, you can't do that, that's discriminatory. Let's go to the Adarand case. The Adarand case in 1995, basically, remember now, you see we'll go forward on one thing, we'll go back on another. Here, the Supreme Court held that racial classifications by the federal government must be analyzed under the standard of strict scrutiny, and that race is not a sufficient condition for a presumption of disadvantage. So basically, for those of you that work in the business world, this is all about minority set-asides. Again, we have this huge documented undisputed history of discrimination in contracting. That Black and brown and minority businesses were not getting the contracts, that they were not getting all these sorts of things. And so that put this business community that far behind, right? The remedy that many municipalities and governments put in place was to create what they call minority set-aside programs so that we could try to make an impact on the damage that was done. This case basically puts an end to that and says that, no, you can't do that anymore. So basically, discrimination is rampant, it harms the society, and then the Supreme Court is coming back and saying, no, you can't do that anymore. Let's go a little bit further in another education case. Again, even when you get a positive decision, people still try to push against it. Grutter and Gratz, these are cases against the University of Michigan and its undergraduate and its law school admissions process. So the positive result, so you remember, they attacked using race. Now diversity is under attack. Here, the Supreme Court ruled that the use of affirmative action in school admission is constitutional if it treats race as one factor among many. Its purpose is to achieve a diverse class and does not substitute for individualized review of applicants. So basically, the takeaway is that in the Grutter and Gratz decisions, the Supreme Court says that, yes, you can continue to use diversity and it is still a compelling government interest. Okay. You're muted, right?
And so we moved into Black Lives Matter. So we went, VP Solomon has now gone through the cases to 2003, but in 2013, we become familiar with hashtag Black Lives Matter, which was founded in response to the acquittal of Trayvon Martin. And I mentioned earlier that if you do a parallel between Trayvon Martin, Sabrina Felton, Mamie Till, and Emmett Till, you will see a lot of the same parallels. And if you think about the years 1955, 2013, and we're still dealing with this aspect of Black boys being killed and Black men being killed based on the color of their skin, but the justification as an officer or someone who, in that case, was a neighborhood watch. But thinking about, what Black Lives Matter, and we get into this whole concept of all lives matter, but we have to understand that when we talk about Black Lives Matter, it's from a historical connotation of Black lives not mattering. And you have seen it today. You've seen it from 1619 until current, the slide that we're at with 2013. Of how when there's progress, there's always something to take us back to subjugate a Black person and say that their life is not important, that their rights are not important. And so this is how you get hashtag Black Lives Matter to support the system of what it means to a Black life and to a Black body. Ta-Nehisi Coates talks about in Between the World and Me, how do we move in these Black bodies? How do we operate in this space when you're within the confines of a Black body, and especially within American society? W.E. Du Bois also goes into the idea of double consciousness and code switching. And he talks about, how do I live within these two worlds? How do I live within American society as a Black person? And so you have the Black America, and how do I operate and move within those space? There's another couple of theories that talks about this concept of shifting, and how do we shift as Black women in our everyday life from our social environments to our work environments, to our home environments, into that space, and how do we move as it relates to being in a Black body and being a Black life. And so you had the start of Black Lives Matter, which is a Black Lives Matter Global Network Foundation, Inc. And so the mission is to eradicate white supremacy and build local power to intervene in violence inflicted on Black communities by state and vigilance, by combating and countering acts of violence, creating space for Black imagination and innovation, and centering Black joy. We are winning immediate improvements in our lives. I had students this last semester who relished in the idea of Black joy. And when they talked about Black joy, it gave me excitement to see young people, young students really understanding what Black joy meant. I always say that, after last summer and the social unrest and social injustices that happened with George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, is that we had this push where everyone wanted to say Black Lives Matter, but really not understanding what it meant for the Black life and the Black life to be in that space at that particular time. And so we got into this space, and I told VP Solomon this at one time, is that, you know, we had people popping up with initiatives and programs and this and that. And we want to create this diversity council. We want to create this diversity initiative. We want to create this diversity program, and with good intentions to support Black lives. But some of the programming was causing more harm than good in the support of Black lives, because it became tokenism. It became a misuse of the Black life in order for that. And, you know, that takes us into the whole concepts and the ideas of the white savior, or the person who's put forth to assist, and that Black people can't achieve unless they have a white person to move them forward and move the race forward. And so in those initiatives, I really got to a place where I said, we've got to stop. We've got to rethink what we're doing and stop popping up with initiatives that are creating and causing more harm than good in this push to support Black lives. And so as we continue to think about what it means for a Black life to matter, we have to think about our daily work. And what are we doing in our daily work? We say we want to support Black life. We say we want to support the increase and advancement of underrepresented minorities. But in that increase in advancement, I go back to something VP Solomon has said earlier about the pushback. And the pushback in the advancement is, are you pushing back against the norms of what have been within the space that you're operating in? Or are you supporting changes to support the Black life? And then we'll move to our next slide and take you back into some more cases.
All right, we're only going to do one more case, and I want you to stay ready because we're going to move to the executive orders. But we wanted to add this particular case, Fisher versus University of Texas, because remember the previous one was in the early 2000s dealing with Grutter versus Gratz. And this is added only to remind us is that the opposition does not quit, it comes back. And again, Abigail Fisher filed suit against the University of Texas because of their efforts to diversify and to integrate. But thankfully, the US Supreme Court held that the university's race-conscious undergraduate admissions program did not violate the Equal Protection Clause. So again, we have to remember that the opposition to matters of equality and justice are tenacious, and we need to be the same. And let's talk a little bit about the executive order, which brings us into 2020.
And so with the executive order, it's really interesting when we talk about the executive order. And I know some of you all had the opportunity to be a part of our bias trainings when this first came out last year. And then we've got, we had individuals that contact our office in fear of what may happen if they're teaching on discrimination, if they're teaching on bias, based on this executive order that was put forward by former President Trump. But in the executive order, what's interesting, if you have not read this executive order 13950, I recommend reading it. And the reason that I recommend reading it is because you can see how the language has been twisted within the executive order to support this idea that bias training, diversity and inclusion supports this aspect that is hindering or discriminatory towards white males. And in this executive order, such language is used to refer to Martin Luther King's that, you know, one day he hoped that his daughters would be judged by the content of their character instead of the color of their skin. And I that made me begin to think about how, and I'm gonna throw a biblical reference, how Satan knew scripture. And so I think about Trump and the fact that he had this idea of knowing the language. And so using the language to support a counter argument that was completely against what bias training and diversity and inclusion does or supposed to do as it's working to create culture and climate change within the spaces that we occupy. And you can see some of the language on this slide. to combat offensive and anti-American race and sex stereotyping and scapegoating. All of this, bias training, white males acknowledging privilege, is contrary to the fundamental premises underpinning our republic, that all individuals are created equal and should be allowed an equal opportunity under the law to pursue happiness and prosper based on individual merit. That's the idea of pulling oneself up by them bootstraps. But if you don't start with equality, and is there inequity, how do you pull yourself up when you never have the leverage to be able to be at the same space that somebody else is? And the next one, you can see this. People are pushing a different vision of America that is grounded in hierarchies based on collective social and political identities, rather than an inherent and equal dignity of every person as an individual. This ideology is rooted in the precariousness and false belief that America is an irredeemably racist and sexist country, that some people simply on account of their race or sex are oppressors, and that racial and sexual identities are more important than our common status as human beings and Americans. And if you just look at this language, you can see how language can be used to take us back 10 steps. And this is an example of an order that took us back 10 steps in this executive order. And this executive order has also been a contributing factor. Oh, I won't jump ahead. Never mind.
So we'll get to it real quickly. I mean, really, I think that it really is a contributing factor to all this language about critical race theory, but we'll get to that. But this is just really, this is a great cartoon which looks at the 1921 Tulsa Massacre, which is not covered in history books at all. And you got the kid that says, "What else don't we know?" And there's a host of things that's not being taught simply because we don't know. History is vitally important. And let's get the next quote from Spanish philosopher George Santayana, which says that those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. I know Winston Churchill is noted as stating this, but he's actually quoting Santayana. We're doomed to repeat it. We're condemned to repeat it. We need to know our history. We need to know it. And as I've said before, we need to know the good, the bad, and the ugly of our history. And you know why? Because you see this? This is 2021. This is the insurrection. This is what happened. Next slide. Here we have the Confederate flag going through our nation's capital, right? Next slide. We see here a noose prepared to hang the vice president and anybody else simply because they did not do what Trump wanted and because they were willing to count the votes of Black and brown people who determined our presidential election. This is, if you don't understand history, then you won't understand that this is a repetition of what happened before in our history. And it's important to know that. You can go ahead to the next slide.
Yes, and so this takes me from the executive order to this slide, and in the midst, the insurrection. But the executive order was another, when we talk about catalyst, this catalyst to argue against this idea of teaching bias training, teaching anti-racist work, teaching or supporting aspects of diversity and inclusion, is that we get into now, today, 2021, yet again, another setback that's saying, let's stop teaching Black history, let's ban critical race theory, and let's keep this out of the classroom. And so you have this push from individuals that are saying, we don't need to teach Black history. We don't need to talk about critical race theory. We don't need to talk about race and racism and its effect on American society and the truth that exists amongst race and racism. We have people that are still arguing that race and racism does not exist. And we know we can go through a whole lesson on race, visit one of our other presentations where we delve into race and talking about race as a social construct. But because of race being a social construct, racism exists and racism is real. And so racism and aspects of racism are talked about in critical race theory. And it must continue. As Robert said, if we don't know our history, then we don't understand how we are where we are and how do we get beyond where we are. And then we also see the cycles of history repeating themselves. And we see, because with the insurrection, you see those 2 slides that showed, and we didn't make up these slides. Those were images from the insurrection, where you have a noose, and we know the connotation of a noose. A noose represents lynching, and we know the connotation of the Confederate flag. And so looking at that from those lenses. And so we are going to move into now our discussion portion. And I will let Robert touch this last slide, and then we will come back to the discussion portion just so we can stop sharing and see everyone.
Right. So, I mean, ultimately, and it speaks for itself in many ways. Colonialism was legal, slavery was legal, the Holocaust was legal, Jim Crow was legal, apartheid was legal. Legality is a matter of power and not justice. And it is so important for us to understand that context. And it's important for us to understand how Juneteenth is such a powerful point in our history, and how it is bookended by so many other issues in our society. All of these things existed despite their legality. It does not really support the idea that it was just. But what we seek is justice. What we seek is freedom, and Juneteenth reminds us of how important freedom is and how important it is for us to continue our fight. So we didn't leave you a whole lot of time, but we got a whole 18 minutes. What is that? Am I adding right? 17 minutes to really to get some discussion and some thoughts. So please go ahead, Heather.
Yeah, so I'll go back and I'll kind of pose our question for our discussion just to get us going, and then I'll put it in the chat also. But how did the delay of freedom shape America as a result of Juneteenth? So how do you when you think about that, and I talked about and went through the idea of the historical connotation or the historical cases and acts of Juneteenth, from the emancipation to the 13th Amendment to the Civil War ending to Juneteenth to the actual ratification of the why did my mind go to the actual ratification of the 13th Amendment? But how do you think this delay, 2.5 years later after the Emancipation Proclamation, is when Texas was notified? What do you think this delay, or what was the connotation of this type of delay on American history?
Yeah. And how does it impact us as a society? What are the other messages or lessons that we can take from this? And
please talk to us. Don't be afraid.
You can raise your hand. You can unmute. Any thoughts or observations? Maybe it isn't to the specific discussion question, but impressions.
Yeah, I was going to say, and if you have anything else that you want to add, it doesn't have to be to this discussion question. Please feel free to comment or share.
I don't know. Hold on, let me turn on my camera. Hi. I know about some of this stuff that you talked about already, but then again, I have a history degree and I listen to history podcasts, and this should be the sort of thing that's common sense, common knowledge. As for the delays in the delay of letting people know that they could be free, I think that's just an example of what we're going to be dealing with over and over again, generation after generation, unless there's laws that say, no, these people can vote. No, it's okay to rent to someone here, and it's just going to keep happening. And it may not be as obvious as slavery, but these little petty attempts to make sure somebody doesn't have the right to live on this side of the red line or some such thing, it might as well be a law. It might as well, I'm trying to think of my point. Just because somebody signed the signed a piece of paper that said, okay, everybody's free, doesn't mean that everybody else was on board. And that's something that has to be kept fighting against and pushing against for generations. And it sucks that we have to keep doing it. And yet there's probably people who look like me that are like, oh, everything's fine now. So my thoughts.
I'll share what's in the chat also, is that we get from Kim. Kim says, I didn't know white female fragility was a problem until recently, even though I read To Kill a Mockingbird, and it is very present in there. I'm glad for these platforms to educate me. Yes, I recommend white fragility to everyone. It's like my goal, especially for understanding, because Robin DiAngelo quotes in the book of how white liberals can be the worst for the movement. And it's this idea that we feel in general, and this is overarching, that we don't have more to learn. And we always have more to learn. When we're dealing in any aspects of race and racism, it's a daily change, it's a daily education, it's a daily learning. And so I think about, even with history that you're speaking of, Patricia, is that in history, we are always learning, and we are always learning a different aspect of truth that comes out. And then Laura says, I would say that the delay of freedom has impacted our cultural consciousness, and that the majority of white folks were conditioned to believe that Black feelings don't really matter. The delay is almost gaslighting, treating the issue as if it doesn't matter or isn't that big of a deal. And really understanding, you know, when we talk about this delay, is that this delay is, you're talking about a person's body, a person's freedom, a person's life being delayed, not just the one aspect, but this is an entire subjugation of a race and individuals that was held back because of a delay of an announcement.
You know,
and purposeful. We have to understand purposeful. It wasn't a mishap.
Right. I wanted to add that I think that it's such a microcosm for things that we see today, right? So even 2 months, right? You got 2 years after the Emancipation Proclamation. You've got what, roughly 2 months or so after the surrender, Robert E. Lee's surrender, and yet these troops in Texas, you know, kept fighting, and they kept things going. And it is a microcosm of privilege, right? That says that I don't care what the law says. I don't care what happened. I'm right. I'm going to keep doing this, and I'm going to keep oppressing and doing whatever I want to do. And we see that today. I thought that's what this insurrection was. I mean, I think that former President Trump is a poster child for, it doesn't matter. I don't care if everybody thinks that this is wrong. I don't care if I've been proven wrong. I don't care if I've been elected out. I'm going to continue to do what I want to do and hold on and to claim to it. And I'm just going to make my lawlessness be the law of the land. And that's exactly the kind of behavior that really fuels, unfortunately, far too many people in our society. Let's see, we got Richard's comment there. Richard says, the delay enabled the continued belief structure of the other, a concept that allows a socially approved dehumanization and demonization of someone different from yourself. It also fortified the continued social structure and its continual power disparities. Yes, great comment, really powerful.
With the delay in getting to Texas, it gives me this feeling of lack of importance, of like, oh, it's an afterthought, like we'll just get there when we get there, and how we consistently keep seeing that with every new law and every new court case coming through. It's like, okay, fine, like we'll move on, we'll actually do this thing. But it's like, until you hold somebody to the fire, they're not actually going to like follow what any of these laws and rules are. And I see that so often, and people are like, oh, I didn't realize that. I'm like, read a book. Like, read a book. There's loads of them out there.
Let's see, we have a comment from Anne. Anne says, I strongly agree and applaud your notion of knowing and understanding history being important. We must promote the study of history and the study of humanities in general. Thanks, Anne. We appreciate that thought. You know, I would also add that when we think about all these issues, I think it is so vitally important that we embrace our history as it is. And I'm not sure what it is about people in American society that are unwilling to admit and acknowledge wrong and mistake. Our history is not a beautiful history, but there's some good things and there's some bad things. And I think that understanding all of it makes us better. If we color it or if we shade it a certain way, then we don't learn any lessons and we can't grow from it. And it's vitally important we recognize that a true, balanced, and accurate history better prepares us for a more prosperous future. Any other comments and questions?
I'd like to thank both of you for a really powerful presentation this afternoon. And, you know, I'm from the Department of Bioethics. I'm thinking of the title of one of the students' papers this semester. And her title was "The United States, a Terrible America." And, you know, when I think about one of my friends who signs all of her correspondence, the Rhonda Williams, who's from Case, but now at Vanderbilt, she always signs it in the struggle. You know, we're all in the struggle. And the fact that there's this, you know, scaffolding with all the, you know, with all the meanings attached to that, that we are all always dealing with. Our history, our everyday reality, moving in and out of all these spaces, figuring out where we are, who we are, what the threats are that we're dealing with, seen and unseen, who's acknowledging them, who's pretending that there are threats that may exist or not exist. You know, it's exhausting. And so when we have these days like Juneteenth, it really is important and powerful to have frameworks and moments like these where we have these things put in perspective. So I really appreciate that. And, you know, the words that you brought to all of us today.
Yes, I think, thank you, Elise, and I agree. You know, it's important to put why we celebrate holidays in perspective. I'm going to quote again, and Kurt's, I don't know if Kurt's on this call right now, but again from On Juneteenth, and she stated, Dr. Gordon Reed stated in that book that, you know, she had to look at the fact that that in Texas they celebrate, you know, remember the Alamo, and why not Juneteenth? Why not celebrate our history as it relates to the aspects of freedom? And so really thinking about that and thinking about that as a community and what we celebrate and what we recognize. And I saw a couple people had unmuted, so we have a few more minutes just to give a chance. And I see that Patricia's unmuted, and Anthony, I don't know if you're unmuted also to speak. And
Okay.
Jason, I saw you were unmuted.
Yeah, I was just going to simply say that, you know, going back to your question about the delay, I'm always amazed by how, and I learned a lot of this through reading the 1619 Project in its entirety, the economic impact of slavery. So arguably the folks in Texas that decided not to tell about the Emancipation Proclamation were really trying to get another free harvest in. I mean, at the end of the day, so much of what we do in race relations is about the perception that a gain on this side of the aisle is an automatic loss on this side of the aisle. And I think that's why you see the Tulsa incident was not an isolated incident. There were hundreds of those happening when Black economies began to thrive. And so the economic piece, I think, slavery itself, I mean, the value of slaves as property was in the billions. Most of my career was in banking. Banks used to use slaves as collateral. I mean, it was the business side of it, which is what people fought for. And then, of course, after the Civil War, slave owners got reparations. They got reimbursed for the value of the slaves that they had to set free.
Mm-hmm.
So the economic piece is something that we've got to keep in mind as well.
You know, it's interesting, Tony. You are absolutely right. after Reconstruction and what Andrew Johnson did, all the land that was given to the former enslaved, by the end of it all, it had all reverted back to all of the landowners, the slaveholders, before it was all over. So basically, any progress that happened after Reconstruction was wiped out. But it is really interesting when we talk about the concept of reparations. Actually, the slave owners got reparations, not the enslaved. So that talk about a statement, right? But let's, we're about out of time, so we'll wrap up. But I want to say this.
Robert, before you wrap up,
Okay.
I don't want to remiss this, that Patricia she has been unmuted for a while, so I want to give her an opportunity. Okay.
Yes, please.
I'll try to make it quick. Excuse me. I thought of something else regarding the original question about the delay, the 2-year delay. And it occurred to me, we're just talking about economics. That's 2 years that somebody could have been earning their own money and not only building their own wealth, but starting generational wealth. That's another problem with racism and redlining and all this. It's somebody could have been saving money to buy their own ranch land in Texas, and that could have been something that their kids and grandkids and so forth could have inherited and build generational wealth. And we still see some of that today when somebody tries to sell a house. Sometimes you'll see a story where a Black person is trying to sell their house and they're told, well, it's only worth this much. But when a white friend is in the house trying to sell it to an appraiser or whatever, and the appraiser gives them this much. I mean, we're still dealing with this economic issue of it. And I realize that's not as important as voting and the like, but it is important.
A very good point. Very good point. That did have a significant economic impact. That should be considered, particularly when we think about the concept and the context of reparations and why, and it is coming into greater discussion today as opposed to many years before. But again, I'll add that every time we make progress, we also face opposition. And so as we conclude, let's think about where we are today. So where do we go from here? And I think it's important to know that acknowledging all of these challenges, acknowledging what's happened throughout history, acknowledging the importance of Juneteenth, I think all of that should give us context for our struggle and for our charge today. And I hope that we each can walk away from today, one, knowing that all of our history is important and we should be determined to make sure that we teach it. Second, we should try to find what does that mean for me as the individual? How can I make an impact? And every single one of us in our gathering today can have a positive impact on our society. And I think that as we do so, we recognize that we are going to face opposition. So we sometimes we get caught up in the joy and the positivity, and then we get blindsided when we face opposition. And I would encourage you to not be discouraged when you face opposition, but stand resolute, continue to do your research, continue to learn from history, and continue to share what you know with others so that we can move the needle forward and not take freedom for granted. And that we must always, just like democracy, always work on democracy, we must always work on diversity, equity, and inclusion, and know that we have those who surround us and support us and that believe these things and are willing to work towards these things in a compassionate and committed way. So that's all that I have, Dr. Burton. Any other closing remarks that you might have?
No, I don't. I think it's what you have said is a great charge to us as a community. And specifically when we think about our work at Case Western Reserve University, what does Juneteenth mean to our work? and not letting Juneteenth just be a celebration, but a continued effort. And I saw Tony put what Aisha Bell Hardaway had quoted,
Yes.
and it's a great quote to keep this in mind, is that we need to be careful to not allow marking holidays to be a substitute for the work that needs to take place. And we have seen that with many holidays that are granted to the Black community, such as Martin Luther King Day, is that the holiday becomes just a time for celebration and not negating the fact that it should not be celebrated or that we should not provide recognition. But what we have to ask ourselves is, in that celebration and in that recognition, what am I doing to continue the work of a Dr. King, to continue the work of those that survived Juneteenth and were a part of the announcement of Juneteenth? And so really asking ourselves, how do I contribute? And I jokingly will say this: if you're giving me pushback on the faculty side, then question yourself there. That's just a joke ending. But really thinking about, how do we move the needle forward as an institution if we are truly committed to celebrating aspects of Juneteenth and other holidays?
Yes, absolutely. I think Hillary has put some links in there for other programs and things that are going on. If you will go to the OIDIO page, and the provost has a page of different programs that will be going on Saturday. I know there's a Freedom Fest. I know I'll be volunteering with the Urban League, but there are a number of other folks around town that will be celebrating and marking Juneteenth. And we'll take Professor Hardaway's and Tony's quote to heart, that we should be thinking about, what am I doing for the cause of freedom on Juneteenth? All right. And you don't have to if you don't get it done on the 19th, do it the next day.
Yeah.
And we'll work for the cause of freedom. Thank you all very much for giving us your time.
One announcement that to add to the Juneteenth that did not get out, and that was from the medical school. The medical school is actually doing a Juneteenth food giveaway and fun. I think today from 5. I think it starts at 5. I'm not sure, but I think it starts at 5. But it's across the street from the Art Museum and in Zone 1. So if you have an opportunity, please stop by and support our medical school efforts as well for Juneteenth celebration.
Check out all the links in the chat. We'll leave it up enough for you to click on them if you want to go to some of the links in the chat for different things that are going on. Anything else for the good of the order, Dr. Burton?
That's it. I want to thank everyone, and everyone have a great afternoon, and we will see you at the next presentation.
All right.
Thank you.